Hi, and welcome to this week's Stockscores Market Minutes. This week, I want to talk about sell signals. It's one of the questions I get most often. And so for stocks that are doing well, we have a different sell signal than for stocks that are not doing well. This week, we're going to focus on when to sell a winner. And it really comes down to understanding trend. If the stock is in a strong upward trend, then we want to sell when the trend line is broken. But there's some caveats to that, and I'll show you those on a chart. So as I said, stocks and upward trends should be held as long as the trend is up. When the trend line is broken, we're going to sell. But if the trend gets very steep, then you want to shorten the time frame for the sell signal. If the trend is more gradual, then lengthen the time frame. So for example, if I'm normally a position trader, I might look at the daily chart for my sell signal. But if the trend goes parabolic, if it goes very steep, then I might shorten it to a 30-minute time frame. If it's a more gradual trend, then I might go to the 3-year weekly time frame. Now the sell signal will be even stronger if there is a falling top. So let's look at some examples here. This is a stock that we've talked about a few times. It's one of my stocks featured in my newsletter. And in this case, the trend was very steep at the end. All right, so it starts out here quite shallow. So when we talk about trend line, the way you identify the trend line is start with inflection points. So anywhere there's a little bottom, little valley, we can put an inflection point on that, and then we connect the dots by drawing a line across it. If the trend gets steeper, then we've got a steeper line. If it gets even steeper, now we've got a parabolic trend. So in this scenario up here, you would want to shorten your time frame to a 30-minute chart, so that when you had this big reversal day right there on the 30-minute chart, that would show as a break of trend. If you just waited on the daily chart, you'd be one day later when the trend line was broken there. Let's go to a 3-year weekly chart of Apple, and we can draw a number of different trend lines here. You can draw the major trend, so we start with the inflection points, something like that. And I'm going to draw a line across those inflection points. That's going to go something like that. And so the long-term trend has been up for 3 years. However, along the way, we've had these little minor trends, one broken right there, and that was a signal to sell. And it kept you out of Apple for the next, whatever that is, almost a year, until we got a new breakout right in here, and now we started a new upward trend. Broke the trend line right there, time to get out. New breakout, all right, new trend. Broke the upward trend right there, get out. Now we're in a downward trend, and then we break out from a rising bottom right here. And so now Apple is in a new upward trend that is holding. All right, so again, to review, the way we define the trend is go with the inflection points. Any little points along there, we draw a line across them. When that line is broken, sell. So if you were in Apple right now, I would tell you to hold on to the stock because it is in the upward trend. If it were to move down through this line, let's draw that in red. If we were to move down through that line right there, then we would have a sell signal. All right, so now we're going to get into our normal market analysis. We're going to go to the Stockscores website, and a reminder that I do a free weekly email every week. You can register for that right here. I do stock picks in there. We've had some good picks in that newsletter for free. But let's start with a look at the S&P 500, and let's look at our trend. So I can start with the inflection points and draw a line across them. I've got an upward trend line, so it still remains a hold. If I went to the shorter term time frame, you can see that we broke the short term time frame right here, and just this week now breaking out again, so now it's back into an upward trend. So bullish on both time frames there. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ. QQQ is the symbol. Same sort of scenario. Upward trend is intact. If I go to the short-term time frame, the 1 month, 2-hour chart, I can see that it is making new highs. So we're back bullish. I was neutral on this market and the S&P for that matter through here because we had broken that upward trend line and it looked like we were going to be stuck for a little while. And that's exactly what happened. We went sideways for 2 weeks. Moving along to the Russell Small Cap Index, the small cap stocks have been a little choppier. The trend is still up on the daily time frame, but if you go to the 1 month chart, you can see it's up, but it's volatile, and that volatility tells us that investors are uncertain. So The small cap market is still relatively strong, but with some uncertainty, and that deserves a little bit of extra fussiness when you're looking at those small cap stocks. Let's take a look at the TSX now. TSX has also been a little choppy through the month of October, and that's largely because of profit taking in the gold market. And so in the short term, I would say it's sort of neutral to slightly bullish. In the long term, it's still bullish. Let's take a look at that gold chart because, of course, we had a breakdown in gold when we talked about it last week. And here's where the trend went parabolic. And so in that parabolic trend, we can shorten the time frame to a 1-month chart. And that's where you see the trend line was broken right here. And that's why I lowered my rating on gold. The chart for silver looks almost identical. They both were lowered. The ratings were lowered last week. Let's take a look at the US dollar. UUP is the symbol. And if we go to the 1-month chart first, we can see the trend is up. So we're starting to build momentum. But that 3-year weekly chart still fighting against all of this pessimism from over here. The good news is we've broken the downward trend. We're starting to build rising bottoms. So the US dollar is getting stronger. Let's take a look at the Bitcoin chart. And if we go to the short-term time frame, you can see downward trend over the last couple of weeks, so a little bit bearish there. But the long-term trend, this is interesting because the short-term trend is weak. The long-term trend is still intact. We're still in an upward trend, barely, but we are still in that upward trend. Finally, let's take a look at the bond market. TLT is the symbol. And there you can see the bottoms are rising on the daily time frame, so that's good. 1-month time frame, bottoms are rising, buyers are in control. 3-year time frame, yeah, still fighting with this overhead resistance from here, upside a little bit limited. So we're improving, but we're not yet in a strong long-term upward trend. So my ratings then, bullish on both time frames for US large cap, NASDAQ, and small cap. Short-term neutral for the Canadian market, but long-term bullish. Gold still bearish in the short term, neutral long term. That's a downgrade. Oil neutral in both time frames. US dollar bullish in the short term, but long term neutral. Bitcoin bearish, short term, long term neutral. And you can see their bonds short term bullish and long term neutral. All right, let's take a look at the trade of the week. Every day we're trading in our service at stockscores.com called Active Live, where you can watch my live analysis of the markets. Most of it's done by computer, looking for stocks making action candles. Action candles are examples of where the stock is trading with abnormal volume and abnormal price action. And when we look at a chart, this shows up as a little pink and yellow dot on our TradeStation charts. And so we had some abnormal activity right at the start of the day on NUAI. And you could have bought it there. That's a pretty good signal, but I actually liked it better on the break of this pullback with that action candle there. So the market goes up, it's in a pullback, people taking profit. It builds a little rising bottom and then breaks the downward trend, and that starts the next leg up. And that was a pretty good move on a stock that's given us some great trades through the month. In this instance, going from around $4.75 to $6, a pretty good little day trade in the market on a stock that keeps on giving. This has been a hot stock for a while. Well, hope you've enjoyed this week's Stock Scores Market Minutes. If so, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave a comment. Do you think the markets are still destined higher, or are we in a bubble ready to burst? Love to hear your thoughts on that. Hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, trade well.